Okay, so on this particular part of our video, there's a part three of the series now. So now we are going to focus our attention on the actual coaching feedback cycle. Okay, so now we've done our looked at the scope and sequence. We've kind of observed how to identify the waterfall and what action steps we're going to do. Now we are going to practice and look over, not necessarily practice, but be familiar with how we are going to conduct our feedback. Okay, because that's just as important as everything else, right? So let's go ahead and get started. But before we do that, we are going to watch a video of giving feedback. And so the points to ponder upon are things like this: how does Ashley launch her feedback meeting? And what are all the steps that she takes in guiding her teacher? So those are the few feedback, just points to ponder on that we're going to watch. Okay, we're going to keep an eye on. Let's go get started. So I'm going to play.
On direct instruction. The past few weeks before spring break, we've been focusing on direct instruction. Today, when I was in your class, it was great to see before students jumped into practice, you asking one conceptual and one procedural question prior to the independent practice. What was the impact of that on their practice?
Well, specifically when it came down to the conceptual question, getting them to stamp that their own self-check and understanding that zero should equal zero if you solve for the correct x was great self-check method for them.
Yeah. I noticed that as well. There were less hands during that time. Which led to students having a more sustained practice time. So great job. It's really good to see. So now that we've set students up to successfully tackle the IP, I want us to start to think about what we do, how we use data during independent practice. Okay. So specifically today, I want to focus on aggressive monitoring.
Okay.
Think back to our last PD before break. What are the keys to aggressive monitoring?
I would say that the main focus would be to collect data, in the moment data, just to get a feel of I think where your class is at. What else? I feel like that's the main focus for AGMO.
Great to hear. So keeping that in mind, I'm going to push your thinking a little bit, and I'm going to show you a video of Mr. Frazier's class during his practice.
Okay.
And I want you to think about what is Mr. Frazier saying and doing to ensure that student papers look like his exemplar, and what impact does this have? Let's write that question down. Let's watch. What'd you notice?
Okay, so I have a couple of things. He announced before they started, I'm going to be checking for certain things.
Okay.
And then he said, the first thing I'm going to be looking for is amplitude and midline. He announced that there won't be any hands during that first round for students to refer to their notes. He was physically collecting data on his clipboard per round, I think. And then for his next round, he announced what he was looking for the next time. So first time it was amplitude and midline, and the second time he was looking for range.
What do we call that?
Laps?
Naming the laps.
Yeah.
And what was he doing with student papers?
He was physically coding them. So as he was going around per round, I don't know what the actual codes were, but he was either checking and circling, but each round he knew what he was looking for and was okay, yes, this is right, or no, go back.
What impact do you think this had on student learning?
Well, it's definitely something that I need to work on, which is the actual physical collection of data. It allows kids to kind of have a flow of the thought process out loud of what their work should look like, which is the exemplar.
Absolutely. So thinking about your own practice, you just mentioned a little bit of this. So when you think back to your independent practice today, what is the biggest gap between your practice and what you did today and what you just saw Mr. Frazier do?
I think my two biggest areas of concern or two biggest areas of growth would definitely be a code per round, and then what I'm looking for per round.
Okay. And what should you do with that code while you're walking around?
Marking it on kids' paper.
Marking on kids' paper.
Yeah.
And in order for you to think through that code, what should you have prior to?
An exemplar. So if I'm looking at the exemplar, then I should know exactly what my round should be.
So, as we were discussing, if you want your teacher to get what you're trying to get them to do, you have to get them to see it first. So, in other words, you have to have you have to give them an idea of what it is that you're looking for, right? And for them to be able to see it is then they can now believe it. That's the phrase that we are working on here. All right. So, to see the success first, you have to name where the teacher has succeeded in implementing the feedback. Then you have to see the model. So you have either you can show them how it looks like or how you want it to be done. And then you can narrow the focus and you have to name the purpose of name the example or the purpose of why you're doing it. And they have to see the gap. So in other words, they have to be able to see the differences of what's missing between what you want them to do and what they are currently doing in their class. It is very important because if you are not able to make your teachers realize that they're doing something wrong, how can they fix something, or not necessarily wrong, but something that is lacking? How can they themselves reflect on it and say, hey, I need something different, or I got to follow something else? So those are the big important things that we have to understand in order for us to let them see the gap. Okay, so now we're on to the next video. Okay, let's try this one now.
Let's put all this together because you just really identified the gap here, and I want you to tell me what is your action step this week.
Me? Okay. My action step, I believe, is to create rounds for my I do, and to create a code for each of those rounds, which I will use to collect in the moment data.
Pretty close.
Oh.
Write this down.
Okay.
Your action step for this week is to aggressively monitor through one procedural and one conceptual lap during independent practice. And you've named the how you're going to do that. First, you're going to name the lap and code. Second, mark every paper with pen and exemplar in hand. And this will better allow you to, 3, collect data on the trends for each lab.
What does Ashley say and do to ensure her teacher knows the action steps that she wanted the teacher to follow and do? You don't lock in learning until you stamp it. Transformative action steps name the what and the how. So in other words, you or the teacher has to be able to determine what it is that they want to do and how they're going to be able to do it. So those are all incremental processes that we need to make sure that the teacher is able to do. So when you name it, you have to prompt the teacher to name the action step based on the discussion. Punch the action step with what and the how. What? Your action step is to monitor aggressively. That's example. How? By creating a monitoring pathway, by doing make sure that you do codes, and those are etc. And then lock it in as a teacher to write it down, because to write it down is to have evidence, and they will have use of how to follow it. So let's join the next one. How does Ashley ensure that her teacher will have a successful practice? That's a thing to answer, and you have to perfect the plan before you practice. So, in other words, you cannot practice well until you know exactly what you're looking for. You have to be targeted and focused, right? So, now let's go watch this video.
Great. So now that Okay, great. So now that we have a plan, we're going to jump into some practice. And what I have around the room are your independent practice from today. And you are going to monitor using your lesson plan.
Okay.
All right, so talk me through, what are you looking for?
So I'm doing 4 laps, and I am doing my first lap, which is done completing the square.
And how do students know?
I'm going to be circling if it's incorrect, highlighting where they should be looking to check if it's correct and they can move on.
And how are you collecting data?
Tick marks per lap
Tick marks where?
on my exemplar.
Ready?
Yeah.
Let's go.
Okay. As I'm coming around, I'm now looking at your perfect square trinomial. How did you create your perfect square trinomial?
Pause. What are you going to do? Your code.
Do I tell them that too?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. As I'm coming around, I'm looking for your perfect square trinomial. If I circle it, that is where you should be focusing on. If I check it, move on to the next problem. As I'm coming around, I'm also focusing on if you have the correct signage in your boxes.
Good. Good. What are you saying so far?
Okay, so what I'm noticing is that people are just skipping this step. So they're adding 16 on both sides, but they're not simplifying, and then it messes them up when they have to actually solve for x to find the square root. So they're missing this second step this third step of the perfect square trinomial.
Yeah, that's exactly what I got. Okay, perfect. How did that feel?
Good. I liked it a lot because now, especially for the perfect square trinomial, I know exactly where on the exemplar I'm looking at and where on the paper I'm looking at. So that was good.
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 Let's sit down. Okay. You've just finished your practice. How did that align to what we named in our exemplar?
Well, first and foremost, each round was very clear and concise. So we wanted to make sure that we had a name and a lap for each code. And I think that was great for me. Also, I had the exemplar in hand, and that was great for me to refer back to. And I collected data on trends for every lap. So I think hopefully that aligns to our exemplar.
It did.
Yay.
Great job. Usually I ask you what's the best time, but I'm coming in next period to see this. So that's super exciting. I'd also like to see the exact chart that we used today in your lesson plans from now on. So if you could just keep that in there and reuse that would be great. And then before we close out today, restate for me your action step for this week.
Okay. So my action step is to aggressively monitor one procedural, one conceptual lap by naming each lap in code, marking every paper with the exemplar in hand, and to collect data on trends per lap.
Nice job. Nice job today.
So after watching the video, what was the final step that Ashley take? What the final steps Ashley take to get her teacher to master the action step? So that was the last one, the last questions we have, and please understand that perfect practice makes perfect. You have to meet the teacher at the point of error. So there was a part in the video that the teacher, the coach, did stop the teacher just to ensure that uh, the practice is correct. On the spot, real time coaching is what we use to call the term for that. Okay, so I believe we are now done with our third session of this training, and we may be able to answer some of the questions.